very excited today about today's show because I know it's a hot topic for women, whether they're just before menopause, in menopause. I think a lot of women struggle with this one. So Dr. Leigha Saunders is here, and I'm going to read her bio because I want to make sure I capture everything. She's a doctor who's obsessed with all things sleep, and in her waking hours, you can find her on a mission to help other women gain energy, their balance, their mood, regulate their hormones, and sleep deep at night, which we all want, particularly as they navigate hormone changes through PMS and menopause. And her goal is to help women reclaim their rest so that they can do what sets their souls on fire during the day. And Leah's ultimate mission is to help women chase their dreams and not exhaustion. I love that. So thank you so much, Leigha, for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Carolyn.
So I'm going to start with the first question. Just want to sort of find out a little bit about you before we get into the nitty gritty. Tell me a bit about yourself and why it was you started what you do, and really how long you've been doing it too.
Yeah. So I've been a naturopathic doctor now for almost 10 years. And my story is very common in that I started to struggle with sleep once I became a new mom. And up until that point, I found it very easy to fall asleep and stay asleep and get my rest. And during my pregnancy, people and other moms in particular would say like, oh, get your sleep now, enjoy it while you can. It's not going to last, or you won't get it, once the baby's here. And that as a potential, like a new mom, an upcoming new mom, but you don't really know that. Right. And so when I had my son, he was great as an infant, but then around that 3 to 4 month mark, they typically go through a bit of a sleep regression. And I was also back to work at that time. And so I was just finding it really challenging to balance all of the pieces on such broken sleep. And I really started to appreciate how much of a profound impact sleep deprivation had on me, of course, on my physical health, my mental health, my emotional well-being, my relationship. Like everything is harder when you're tired, right?
You're right.
You're more irritable. You pick fights with your partner. Like everything feels hard. And so when I was back to work, I started to just take note a little bit more often of like how many of my patients were also struggling with sleep, and how I actually hadn't been doing a good job of addressing it in my practice. Unless they brought it forward, I maybe wouldn't ask about sleep quality or quantity. And in many cases, women would just dismiss it anyways and say like, oh, I've always been a bad sleeper, I'm here for something else kind of thing. Yeah. And I didn't actually have great tools, like even as a trained naturopathic doctor with lots of experience, I didn't have great tools to know how to address sleep disturbances because it just hadn't been on my priority. And so once I started to struggle with my own sleep, and this is often what we experience, right? We have our own problem, and we realize that like how significant it is. My own naturopathic doctor at the time, when I was like, when am I going to feel like myself again? How am I going to fix how I'm feeling? Because I was literally crying at the drop of anything. I was feeling so overwhelmed. I was waking up in the morning with anxiety and overwhelm, only to feel like I just need to get through today. And then like the whole cycle would just start all over again. Anxiety about going to bed because, you're not going to sleep good. And then all of that, those feelings that get tied up there. So she was like, you just need to fix your sleep. Like you need to do whatever you can do to fix your broken sleep, because this is a problem. Because once my son started sleeping better and longer, and even through the night, I was still having a challenge. So like that was the problem. And so I did that. I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out, because clearly if I'm struggling, then other people are going to be as well. And so I dived down the research rabbit hole and I started learning everything I could about how I could help myself and ultimately my patients. And once I always say like, I did all the trial and error and experimenting for you. And once I started then applying this to my practice and actually asking better questions about my patient's sleep and inquiring about that a bit more and helping support them in that area, it started to work. Like people started sleeping better and then getting better. And even people who had said that, like, I've always been a bad sleeper, I've struggled with sleep for 10 years. When they started sleeping better and started noticing how much of an impact that was having on every other aspect of their health and well-being, I started to, then I was like, well, somebody else, I've got to connect with like a colleague on this. Somebody else has got to be doing this. So like, let's team up and no one's doing it. Like no one is talking about sleep in particular as it relates to female health and well-being. And so I was like, I need to get this message out, because so many women are just suffering in sleeplessness, right? They just think that with menopause or turning 40 or having a baby or whatever it is, that they just have to deal with a lack of sleep and feeling tired all the time. And if they've always been bad sleepers, it's kind of like the way it's going to be. And I just want to argue with that and say, like, no, I know that you can have a good night's sleep. And I know how much that changes how you feel and what you can do in a day.
Awesome.
Right?
Yeah. Do you know what and I want to have you go over a brief overview of sleep in a second, but I would just want to touch on the topic about, I'm noticing that whether it's sleep or whether it's hot flashes or symptoms or whatever it is with women, especially going through menopause, just because I'm of that age, the more I hear, and I work with women in menopause. So the more I hear, the more I'm talking, the more you're noticing that women just think these things are a given. And so a lot of them don't search out. They don't know the questions to ask necessarily, because you don't know what you don't know. And they just don't realize that there actually is a way to feel refreshed again. So, I love what you're doing. So why don't we start with, for people that don't quite know this, a brief, let's say that again, a brief overview of sleep.
Yeah. So I often get asked the question of, like, how do I know if I'm getting enough sleep? Right. And so a quick check there is that you should fall asleep relatively quickly. And that actually is between 5 to ideally 20, maybe 30 minutes. So that doesn't mean you have to watch the clock, because that is sometimes anxiety provoking as well. But one way to check in on this is if you are consciously thinking about the act of falling asleep, meaning if you're having the thought, okay, it's taking me a while. Why is it taking so long? Here we go again. I'm struggling. It's been too long, because we typically won't have those thoughts if we're falling asleep in less than 20 minutes. And so we should fall asleep fast. And ideally we stay asleep over the course of the night. We have micro awakenings every night. So yes, you might wake up to roll over, or you might wake up to use the bathroom. But if you're finding yourself back in that position again, where you've woken up in the night and then start having those thoughts of like, oh, I'm awake now. How long is it going to take me to fall back asleep? It's taking too long. Here we go. What time is it? I only have so much more time to sleep. It's been too long.
Yep.
And so it's okay to wake up if you fall back to sleep quickly. But if you're lying there awake in the night, that's a problem, because we want to consolidate your sleep as much as possible. So ideally you fall asleep fast, you stay asleep for the most part, or if you wake up, you fall back to sleep relatively quickly. You get between 7 to 9 hours of sleep, again, as condensed and consolidated as possible. So what we call your sleep efficiency score is quite high, meaning the time you're actually asleep for the time that you spend in bed is above 85%. And then you wake up in the morning feeling rested.
Okay.
And so if you're someone who's like, because sometimes I get this question too, where people will say, like, I'm worried about my sleep because I sleep for 8 hours or 8.5 hours, but I'm still tired. Then that is a sign to me that we need to do a little bit more digging on a physiological level, because you could have a nutrient deficiency like iron deficiency, B12 deficiency, that can leave you tired no matter how much sleep you're getting. Or maybe there's something going on with your thyroid, because people, and women in particular with low thyroid function, will often say that they have to sleep long hours, and no matter how much sleep they get, they're still feeling like they're trudging through water during the day. And then there's sleep apnea, which is very, it's much more common in women than we think. And because we typically think of it as like a male-based condition, which is not true at all. And it really increases as we progress through menopause. So the incidence in women who are menopausal, it increases for sleep apnea for a variety of different reasons. But that doesn't always look like, because when we'll say, well, I don't snore, I don't gasp in my sleep, I don't wake up with, choking or anything like that. You don't have to. Sometimes for sleep apnea, it's just morning fatigue, it's morning headaches or insomnia, trouble sleeping. It doesn't always present the same way as we classically think of that way as it does in men. So that's what your sleep should look like for good quality sleep. And if any of those things aren't checking the boxes, if you're having trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or not waking up feeling rested despite getting adequate sleep, then we need to do some digging.
Okay. Just one quick question before we go on to the rest. You've got some of these apps out there, you wear a watch and the app's out there and they'll say you were in bed for this amount of time and this percent was deep or restful and this percent was lighter. Is there a number that women should be looking at when it comes to their deep versus light sleep?
Yeah. So we have different stages of sleep. So typically what happens is that when we first fall asleep at night, we'll go into our deepest stages. This is why when you hear the notion that like sleep before midnight really counts, it's worth like an hour before midnight is worth 2 compared to after, because we go quicker into what we call non-REM, or that deepest stage of sleep. And then over the course of the night, our sleep stages get lighter. So we'll spend more time in lighter stages of sleep in the earlier morning hours. And then eventually we spend more time in REM, particularly after 1 a.m. And one thing I'll highlight there, I'll come back to the tracking piece, is that women will often say, I don't dream, and so I must not be getting deep sleep, because we think that our dream-based sleep is our deepest stage of sleep, but that's actually not true. REM is when we dream, and REM is a lighter sleep stage than our deep sleep. And so all of these different stages of sleep do different things for our body. That deep sleep is that rest and repair. So it's that regenerative aspect of sleep where we really start to repair our body and brain, and our immune system gets at work. And there's a whole different cascade of processes that happen in our brain when we're asleep compared to awake. Even though it feels very passive, it's actually very active on a metabolic and physiological level. And so we should have about 20% of our total sleep time be spent in deep sleep.
Okay.
And 20% in REM. And then the rest, so about 60% or more, is actually spent in those lighter sleep stages.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good to know.
And so the key there is to understand that as we get older, so again, as we transition through, say, menopause, it is more likely that you will have lower levels of REM sleep. Like that just happens as we get older. And so what we need to understand then is, like, are we doing and engaging in other behaviors that might be creating even more of an obstacle for us to access a particular stage of sleep?
Okay.
Right. So it doesn't mean that, like, oh, just because you're older, you'll get less REM and then, like, that's it. It's things like, okay, if we are on our screens before bed and having a lot of blue light exposure, if we are actually maybe hopping on a fad diet, and something like the ketogenic diet has been shown to decrease our ability to get into REM sleep, then maybe those things aren't serving us to be able to get as much of each stage as we need.
That's important. Very important. You've answered my next question, because I was, for women that don't, or people, I mean, there might be husbands or partners or anyone watching this, why in particular, actually, maybe we could delve into that a little bit deeper about why it is in particular that our sleep as we age, or especially going through menopause, does tend to decrease?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So we'll see this. And so I want to come back to your question on trackers too. So let's not forget about that. But
okay, I'll write that down.
Women, as we get older, we'll see, actually, if we start back in childhood. So this is the interesting part. When I was compiling some research for a presentation, I came across this beautiful chart. And so if you can think of that classic example of, like, the monkey evolving into a human.
Okay.
This chart looks similar in that there's, like, a little girl and she evolves into an older woman.
Okay.
And there's different stages. So we're talking about childhood, and then puberty, and then reproductive years, and then postpartum, and maybe pregnancy, and then perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, right? Yeah. And so underneath each of these stages, it shows how our different sleep stages actually change according to different hormone levels, and how things like, to state the obvious, we nap more when we are younger and older at the extremes compared to when we're in the middle in our reproductive years, and how wake after sleep onset, so our likelihood to spend more time awake after falling asleep, increases also as we age. And so what we see in girls and boys is that their sleep architecture and structure and duration and stages and things like that are similar until we get to puberty.
Okay.
And then that's when we start to notice a divide in that women or people with ovaries will experience changes in their sleep.
Of course.
Boys or people with, right? So, yes. So what that tells us is that there's a hormonal interplay, right? It's not necessarily causal to say, like, your hormones directly impact your sleep, or like are to blame, but there's a correlation there to say, like, obviously if women experience changes in their sleep as their hormones shift, that there's a relationship there.
Yes.
And so what we do see is that the highest instance of sleep disturbances happen as women progress through menopause. So the 2 years prior and 2 years after are kind of like the peak of that graph. And that's 60% of women will actually experience a sleep disorder or disruption at some point in their lifetime, and the highest likelihood of that occurring around menopause.
Okay.
And to recap, because I know these terms get thrown out a whole lot and thrown around, is that menopause you officially reach when you have not menstruated for 1 full year, not secondary to any other reason. So obviously, if you have something like an IUD and that you're no longer getting your menstrual cycle, that doesn't count. But if you are otherwise haven't menstruated for a year, that's when you're officially menopausal.
Yeah.
And so we'll see for a lot of these women then that the sleep issues continue post-menopause. They don't necessarily just resolve as quickly as they maybe came on. And so there's a large interplay, like you mentioned, hot flashes there as well. And so there's an interplay with our hormones in the sense that for a lot of women, if they start tracking this, if you are still menstruating, you might start to notice changes in your sleep in that premenstrual or luteal phase, which is right before a period. And that's when progesterone and estrogen are being withdrawn. So the levels are decreasing. So often what happens, what this looks like in practice, is women will come in and say, every so often, for no reason, there's like 2 or 3 nights out of the month that I just can't sleep.
Interesting.
And I'll say back to them, like, it's probably in your premenstrual period, like when you're in your luteal phase. And so let's track that. And because then if we can identify it to be a part of the cycle, then we can put specific supports in place. And they'll say like, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's why. And I'm like, okay, let's track it. And they come back and they're like, it's when I'm premenstrual. Yes, see you. And so it's the withdrawal of that hormone that makes us so symptomatic. It's not necessarily like one level or that our levels go below a certain amount. It's the fact that they were higher and now they're lowering, and we experience the withdrawal effects of that essentially. And so that can show up in any of those areas as difficulty falling asleep, more anxiety, more restlessness over the course of the night, maybe difficulty staying asleep. Maybe you even notice that you just have an increased sensation of warmth at that phase of your cycle. And that can interfere with sleep because our core body temperature ultimately has to drop to initiate and maintain deep sleep. And so with something like hot flashes and night sweats, that's what wakes women up, is because obviously there's like a huge increase in core body temperature, that flushing sensation, which can be quite uncomfortable. But it's also important to note that some women just experience hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms as feeling warm. It's not always that dramatic, like turning red and actually sweating. And so part of the other conversation that I want to have and really encourage women to explore is that this notion of like, well, I don't have it as bad as, right? Like a lot of women will say, I don't have it as bad as my sister or my aunt or my cousin or my coworker or my friend who's drowning in their hot sweats or night sweats. For you, if it's just waking up feeling really warm and that's disturbing your sleep, it's still significant.
Yes.
Right.
And love that point.
Yeah. I just like to hammer that home. So basically, when we're still menstruating, our sleep can start to change. Often we're noticing it either in that premenstrual or menstrual period. And then as we progress through perimenopause and menopause, it can become more obvious. And for a lot of women, sleep can be the first sign and symptom of perimenopause. And we don't know that because it's not something that we necessarily talk about either, right? And so often, for example, women will say like, well, ever since I turned 40 or through my 40s or whatever, sleep has just not been as easy to access. And it can be because underneath the scenes, your hormones are changing and it all has an interplay.
I think that's so important. I mean, I sit here getting so excited every time I speak to a guest. I'm very excited. It's hard to actually not show it, but I think that's so important on so many levels. You're right, because and that's really why I wanted to do this show, and especially younger women. And when I say younger, I mean it could be any age. But I was thinking it'd be really, really good and beneficial to them if like 30-year-old women or 35-year-old women watched and listened, because they can maybe start tracking and start to know these things and start to sort of know beforehand what tactics to put into place. But you're very right. I think that point, I hope the women or people listening really take that home as well, about just because A over here is really having them 10 times a day and really suffering, but I only get this, it's not really affecting me much when it can in so many ways.
Absolutely. And 20% of women at the age of 40 will actually meet the diagnostic criteria for perimenopause. And so I think that when we think about that, we also, many women don't know what perimenopause is or couldn't adequately define it.
That's right.
And we think that we have to experience changes to our menstrual cycle, or maybe to the extent of like women will delay treatment and seeking advice and help with any of these issues like sleep disturbances or hot flashes or vaginal dryness or loss of libido or mood changes. They're like, well, I have to wait until I'm menopausal. I have to wait until my period stops.
Yeah, right? Good point.
Which also is not, it's just not true. Like there's so much that we can do, and there's so much great research to support interventions in the interim. And it's not always hormone replacement therapy, although that can play a role, but we can support you in that transition so it doesn't feel like it's disrupting your whole life.
That's right. And I think as well, you know, sort of going back to your point as well, that that's what I've noticed is a lot of women, and I have to say, before I'd started my journey, didn't necessarily know it a lot. I've learned a lot since, but I was listening to what women were saying, and it seems women didn't know perhaps they had access to naturopathic doctors and to pelvic health specialists. Like they think it's, and don't get me wrong, I love my doctor. My doctor is fabulous. I think there's room for you to have a whole team. As a woman going through or about to go through menopause, I think you have the opportunity for a whole team if it can be afforded, and having different people in your life. And that's why, again, just knowing, speaking to you and somebody saying, well, I had no idea I could go and see a naturopathic doctor about my sleep and other things. And I think that's wonderful. So I've got a question regarding in a minute, sort of about things that we can do for it. But before I do, speaking to this woman that is not getting much sleep at night. She has not had much sleep at night, and she's a bit of a bear every day because she's just totally tired. Can she hope to sleep again with putting some right actions in place?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously I have a bit of a bias here, right? Because this is like my mission and my passion. I'm so excited about it. But I honestly, truly believe like there is no mistake in that we spend 30% of our life asleep. And so the benefits of sleep are profound, and really it's necessary to sustain life. Like we can't survive without sleep. And so the challenge is that modern day life and society hasn't necessarily made it the easiest, right, to keep up with great sleep, because we're essentially a dark deprived society, and light dark signals play such an important role, not just in our melatonin production, but in the timing of so many other hormones that dictate all of our bodily functions, right? And so sometimes it's easy because we need to make a few changes, and we do maybe some supplementation or hormone replacement therapy if we're looking at, say, if it's hot flashes and night sweats that are waking you up, and otherwise you feel well supported and balanced in your life, then maybe it's just addressing the hot flashes. And we know, and the literature supports this, if we address your vasomotor symptoms and the hot flashes, like you sleep better, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe it's more complicated because you've tried numerous medications and have circumstances in your life that make it difficult for you to access deep sleep, right? Maybe there's a high component of stress or grief or trauma, right? Maybe there's dietary challenges or other physical health concerns like pain or like pelvic health issues, right? Bladder waking up, all of those pieces. But what we do know is that if we teach people and women about their sleep, not just it has to go beyond the sleep hygiene. That is for sure. It's not just enough to say like, turn off your phone before bed and, read a book. Like that's not enough. That's a starting point. Cause for some people you do need to just like put down the phone and have a bedtime routine, but certainly that there's more that we need to do. And what I really see is that women aren't being given the full opportunity to actually investigate and explore why they're not sleeping well. And then on the flip side, because of that lack of opportunity, they're not being presented with true answers and solutions to solve that underlying reason, right? So unfortunately, as a woman, you're probably more likely to land in a doctor's office, describe your trouble sleeping, and be told, well, like, of course you're having trouble sleeping. You have a lot on your plate. You're a working mom. You're taking care of your aging parents. You're anxious. Here, take this pill. It's an easier fix. It truly is, right? It's a quicker fix. temporarily, instead of saying like, okay, hold on, let's press pause and let's look at all the factors, right? Could this be modified and managed if we did help you manage your stress, even if we can't help you change the stress that you have? Is there a metabolic component here that might be increasing your risk for sleep apnea that we need to investigate? Is there like a hormonal component? And is this truly because of something else? And if we gave women the opportunity, I think, to explore and understand what they're doing and how that's impacting their sleep and what they can do to positively impact their sleep, I think we would have a very different story to tell.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think because a big part of it is that feeling of lack of control, because there's so many changes that occur to our bodies throughout our life, it seems. But with menopause, again, there's all of these changes that occur. It gets almost laughable. It really does, because you wake up sometimes and I'm in health and wellness and I think I'm strong and fit. And then I'm waking up on some days going, spot on my face, my legs hurt, like what's going on? But I think there's that lack of control, and then double down on that with a lack of sleep. Where a woman is completely feeling out of control, and then no hope. And then it just goes from there. So I think women listening, I'm hoping that they're going to be very excited about this, because, it can be done. I was sleeping 2 hours a year ago, and it wasn't really 2 hours a night. It was mainly crying. And with a few things, tweaks, 7 to 9 every night now. So it can be done. I totally,
absolutely.
So let's talk about, first of all, I don't think we went back to tracking.
Yeah, the tracking.
I
think your point was that you're wondering about, like, is there a certain amount, and are the trackers reliable?
Yes.
Yeah. And so there's a whole host of trackers, right, on the market. I wear an Oura ring, which is a sleep tracking ring, and I quite enjoy it for the ease of just like having it on my hand, and I don't find it uncomfortable to sleep with. And so what we understand is that each device is going to have its own margin of error, meaning like it might have some degree of inaccuracy, but as long as you pick one thing, so pick one device and use that device consistently to track your sleep, even if there is a margin of error, at least that margin of error is consistent, and it's going to be consistent to you, right?
Makes sense.
Whereas if you're like tracking with your Oura ring some night, and then your iPhone or iWatch the other night, and a Fitbit, like they're all going to give you different information that might be hard to accurately compare. And so my recommendation around tracking is that tracking something and looking at the data should always inform behavioral change. So understanding, like, me wearing this ring is not going to get me better sleep unless I do something with the information it gives me.
Great point. Great point.
Right. And the same is for my patients. But where that is helpful is sometimes it tells us, again, depending on the type of tracker that you use, like the sleep stages, for example. So maybe somebody gets adequate deep sleep, but not enough REM. Well, maybe then we're looking at, okay, what can we do to increase REM? Or the flip side, maybe someone's a really light sleeper and they want to increase their amount of deep sleep. Right. So there's different ways that we can use the tracking information to inform our behavioral changes and our treatment plans ultimately. Right. And so I need to do more research on all of the trackers, because there are like so many coming out. But what I typically recommend is, like, if you're interested in tracking your sleep, there's a lot of apps that are available. One I have no affiliation with, it's called Sleep Cycle. You can just easily download it on your phone. It actually uses the microphone to listen for your breathing patterns and your movement to determine if you're asleep or if you're awake. And so that's something that doesn't require an additional device, right? So a lot of people want to get started with that. I think it's a $40 a year subscription, and it can give some really interesting information, especially around coughing and snoring. Because if you're somebody who sleeps alone, that app will actually record if you make noise in the night.
Wow. It's amazing,
And
isn't it?
so, yeah. And so sometimes I'll ask patients, like, do you know if you snore? Because that might increase our suspicion for something like sleep apnea. And they'll say, oh, I don't know, or I don't think so. Because women are also less likely to say, like, yeah, actually I do. And
Yeah.
so that app will tell them if they do, which is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
So it just gives us more data to utilize and work with. And then you can choose to invest in something like a Fitbit or use your iPhone or your iWatch for Apple Watch for tracking. Like I said, I love the Aura Ring because it gives such detailed data. So it does. It tells me like how fast I fall asleep. It gives me a breakdown of those different stages. It tracks my bedtimes. And so it will tell me like your ideal bedtime window is between this and this tonight. So I try to follow through with that. And the newer versions will do things like track body temperature to determine where you are in your menstrual cycle, if you're getting sick, and something called heart rate variability.
I was going to talk about that. Okay.
Yeah. And so heart rate variability is a really great measurement to help us understand your nervous system. So I always say that sleep is the ultimate gauge of your nervous system, meaning that if we're like really overworked and pent up, it can be hard to sleep. I don't think that's an unfamiliar experience for most, right? And so even if we feel like we're managing okay but we're having trouble sleeping, it's like, oh, it's probably telling us something, right? Or if you like wake up, if you fall asleep really fast at the beginning of the night out of pure exhaustion, but then you wake up in the night with a million thoughts running through your mind, right? Well, that's probably your nervous system being like, hey, this is the only time I get you undistracted, right? Like this is the only time I can get your attention to think about all these things. Can you please give this stuff some attention? And so then, it can be really helpful to understand your heart rate variability because, in short, if you've ever given a presentation or done something that has made you feel nervous or seen flashing lights in your rear view mirror when you're driving on the highway, when your heart races and is going boom, 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 that beat is very steady. There's very little variation between your heartbeats. And that's when we're in that fight or flight mode. So we're more under cortisol and adrenaline. Compared to when we're resting and relaxed, then when our heart is basically like, I just need to pump whenever I need to pump, like boom, 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 boom. There's a lot of variation in the time between heartbeats. And we're talking milliseconds, but that can really give us a great measurement of how your nervous system is functioning. Like, are you spending more time, especially overnight, right? Because the whole piece with sleep and rest is that we should be getting that rest and repair and regeneration, which can only happen if we're in that restful mode.
I apologize. There we go. That was my alarm for the appointment.
Okay. Yes. Can you hear my little guy in the background?
No.
Okay, good.
Every now and then, but it's, it's fine.
Normal. So basically, if we are getting adequate time in asleep, but our nervous system is still working overtime. So an analogy for this is like if you ever closed your laptop and it's supposed to shut down or go to sleep, right? But you can hear the fan running, the CPU is still buzzing. That's what it's like for a lot of people. Like their nervous system actually isn't getting down. And what's neat about something like the Aura Ring is that it gives you insight. So it actually measures your heart rate over the course of the night as well. And our heart rate should go down to be at its lowest point in the middle of the night. And then it should actually slowly come back up after as we wake up.
Yeah.
Okay. If it takes all night, so if your heart rate curve looks like this and it takes you all night for your heart rate to get to its lowest point, and your heart rate is at its lowest point, maybe within an hour or less of you waking up, your metabolism and your nervous system has been working overtime all night.
Interesting.
Which then again, it's like, that's why the data is so helpful, because if that's happened to me, for example, the Aura Ring will say like, hey, did you eat too late, close to bed last night? Yeah. And then we can deal with those changes as with my patients. Like that's what we'll work through, is like, look at these patterns and different stages of sleep. And then it influences our treatment plan with a little bit more precision, right? Do you need that? No. If tracking your sleep makes you more anxious, because some people find
that's right. Yeah.
Like they don't want to score, right? They don't want to feel the pressure of like something's tracking their sleep, and it's almost like a performance anxiety. Then don't track. Just listen to your body and check in with yourself. Did I have to think about falling asleep last night? Did I wake up in the night? How do I feel when I wake up after my sleep? Am I feeling rested?
Oh, great questions. So you really, the goal is to eventually get to a place where you're like the time between each heart rate, or where you're very relaxed, the larger number is quicker after you've fallen asleep. So that tells you that you're resting quicker.
So you want a low heart rate overnight, and you want a high heart rate variability.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. That's great. I must admit, I have a tracker, and for me, it's been wonderful. It helped me figure out what actions I need to put in place, which has been a big learning experience this year. But I'm a child. It's been every day I want to beat it. It's like, what did I get yesterday? I want to make sure. So it's for me, it's been a very positive thing. So I think you're right there. That's a really good point. Some people might get stressed just doing something like that, and it's finding, what works for them. This is all wonderful information. It really is. I love this topic. So let's talk about some of the things, when it comes to, anything from food to activity and hormones and supplements. I know light is a big thing, like even going outside first thing in the morning. So your body, because I heard it once and it was wonderful. Your organs can't tell what time of day it is. So go and look outside first thing and last thing at night when you go to bed, and the body gets to understand that it's time to, what kind of things that can women put into their life to begin the process of helping themselves sleep better?
Yeah, light exposure is very powerful. And where we see that peak up in the literature, for example, is when we look at the guidelines for using melatonin as a supplement. It very clearly states, like, if your patient isn't following a regular light, dark, and an appropriate light, dark exposure and routine, melatonin is not going to do anything. Right. So if we're on our screens too late, and if we're sleeping in and in like a really dark environment in the morning, we can have trouble waking up, and then we can have trouble falling asleep. So one of the guidelines is to ensure that your patient is following a regular and appropriate light, dark schedule and routine. And like you said, if we can get light on our faces earlier in the day, it helps wake us up, because it sends that signal for melatonin to stop being released and produced. And then in the afternoon, that's a common time too when people can benefit from light exposure, because we often hit that afternoon slump, right? And sometimes getting up and getting out, and a 5-minute walk, a 2-minute walk, like it just gets our circulation going. It will help increase our metabolism in that regard. It gets that light on our face, our fresh air, it will wake us up. And then ensuring that you're getting dark exposure in the evening is actually really important too. And I notice this, it's so obvious now, and like maybe I'm more sensitive, but I'm working on a presentation for sleep. And ironically, the past 2 nights I've had to put in some time after the kids go to bed to work on it. And I haven't slept well. Like I just have not slept. And I'm like, and this is why I tell people not to do that. Right. So light exposure is certainly an important component. And I'll share, like I work with women and take them through a 5-step framework. And so we sync with your body clock, because we need to tap into that. Everybody has their own unique circadian rhythm and chronotype, which probably heard of, like the early bird or the night owl. So we need to understand where you're at, and are we working to shift that? Or do we just need to tap into it a little bit more and understand where your natural ebbs and flows and energy are, so that we can actually use that to our advantage? And then we lower cortisol, because as we've talked, if cortisol and stress is high and not being managed, then it's that constant running underneath the surface that's going to make sleep really hard to come by. We eat for better sleep, because there's actually a great amount of research, particularly looking at the Mediterranean diet and particular dietary factors in terms of macronutrient composition and things like that, that can help us like access and obtain better sleep, more sleep, better quality sleep, have lower risk of insomnia symptoms. And then I always say we have to embody the sleeper that we want to be, because there's a mindset component. It's really easy, especially as women and mom, to sacrifice our sleep, right?
It's really so true. Easy. We're so used to it.
Totally. And it's easy to convince ourselves that something else is more important, or that if we sleep, we're being lazy, or that's a luxury, right? It's like we get the badge of honor if we're more tired or more exhausted. And then we pinpoint your hormonal sleep connection. So we make sure that we understand and investigate and address if hormones are playing a role here. And if you're paying attention, all of those things actually stand for sleep. So it's think your body clock, lower cortisol, eat for better sleep, embody the sleeper you want to be, and pinpoint your hormone sleep connection.
I love it. That's very clever. I was so focused on what you were saying that had actually sunk in, but I think that's fantastic. It's, oh my gosh. You know what? I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm a big believer that both our sleep and our breath are unsung heroes of our health, really. We focus an awful lot. Great. We focus on what we eat and we focus on working out. I mean, these are my things, but at the end of the day, I think underlying, you know, we're not going to be much help to anyone without sleep. Certainly not breath, but sleep.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting research there too, in showing that, like, if we're underslept, so say if we restrict people to 5 hours of sleep a night for 5 days, maybe seven nights, we can actually see their blood work change in as little as a week, from going completely normal to looking at a pre-diabetic state. And what happens is when we're underslept, our brain chemistry changes, and hormones like ghrelin and leptin, which regulate our appetite control and decision-making around food, and our satiation after eating, change. So we are more likely to overeat, and we're more likely to make decisions that we wouldn't make if we were well rested, meaning we'll reach for more carbohydrates, simple sugars. I love carbs. We should eat carbs. I'm not anti-carb, but we need to understand if we're getting the right amount, right?
That's right. Yes.
And so sometimes we aren't making the best food choices when we're tired, because we need a quick and easy fix. And the exercise benefits aren't going to be the same in a fatigued body compared to one that's well rested.
Very good point.
So if and I was chatting with a mom this morning who was saying, like, she has to get up super early to go and exercise. And she's like, otherwise I can't fit it in. And so maybe that's something that we need to do, right? Like, we need to carve out that time, but sometimes we also just need to have you sleep in if you're really short slept, to get the benefits of sleep, because it's not really going to push you forward if you're short slept and pushing yourself in all of these other areas too.
Yeah, good point. That's a very good point too, because I want to go back to the point about, you know, there's about how the hours that some people sleep, and you know, there are also, I'm thinking of a few people that I know, but there's the group of people that don't sleep very much because they say they don't need it, and they work fine on 4-5 hours of sleep at night. So and then there's the other group that their work, whatever it is that they're doing, is so weighing on their mind that they don't really get the sleep that they need, but they probably could do better focusing on themselves. So I guess where I'm going with that is the one group, is it worth, you sleep what your body needs, and you know what your body needs, I assume. So if somebody's listening and they're like, well, I sleep 4 hours of sleep at night, and that's, I'm great on it. Is that okay? And then the other is, you know, the people that are in jobs or that have businesses that are constantly weighing on them. It's time to, you know, what can they do to actually take stock of what they need for themselves to get a better sleep?
Yeah.
And knowing that Alzheimer's and things like that increase through menopause and stuff.
Absolutely. So when we look at short sleepers who say, like, oh, I get 4 or 5 hours and I'm fine, that's all I need. A couple of things to note. One, I always question, have you just adapted to a new norm for you, and you actually forget how good you can feel, or you don't know how good you can feel? Because that happens all the time in practice. I have women come back and be like, I forgot that I could, like, what I felt like after a good night's sleep, or that I could have this much energy, or I could keep up with my kids, or I could do the workout and still have energy at the end of the day, or like go to work and still be able to be a real person to my family. Right. Yeah. And so one, that's always a question I challenge people on. Two, there's always outliers. So sure, maybe you are actually somebody who's just a short sleeper and that's truly all you need. But most people do need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours. And the reason we say that amount is because when we look at tracking people and understanding the influence of less than 7 hours on a regular basis, we see an increased risk of all the things we talked about.
Okay.
Infection, fertility, hormone and other hormonal concerns, mental health concerns and conditions, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, increased risk of all-cause mortality, which means like dying from any cause, right? And so there's a very real correlation there between the lack of sleep and increased risk of especially cardiometabolic disease like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. And then we'll see if we're sleeping more than 9 hours, there's also an increased risk. And partly that's because most people who are sleeping more than 9 hours probably have a significant underlying health condition like congestive heart failure, or they're maybe in palliative care with, you know, a terminal illness. And so they're spending quite a bit of time asleep. So that 7 to 9 hours is where we see most people will benefit, right?
Okay.
And have sleep then favorably impact other aspects of their health, right?
Can we go back to that point about the premenstrual and the luteal stage, I think you called it. Have you found that when you speak to women, say I didn't sleep, you know, leading up to my periods, is there a connection between that and when you go through menopause, not sleeping? Like, have they found there's a connection there?
Yeah, I don't know of any studies that have looked at that retrospectively, but what we see reported in the literature time and time again is that women experience sleep disturbances according to hormonal changes, right? So, it probably, I would be willing to say that there's probably a link there, right? Because if you are symptomatic of that estrogen withdrawal with the ebbs and flows and progesterone withdrawal with the ebbs and flows, then essentially perimenopause and menopause becomes like an extended version, right? So we find ourselves ultimately in menopause with essentially no hormones, right? No estrogen, no progesterone. And so that's exactly what's happening in our menstrual cycle in the 1 to 2 days and maybe the first 3 days of our cycle, depending on how your hormones ebb and flow. And so probably.
I bet that's interesting. What so somebody could come to you, you can take a full, like you can get their blood, you know, they can have their blood test done, and then you can go through it with them to determine. I mean, that's a huge service, I think, right there, because you don't know, how do we know with anything where we need to be and how to get there in order without knowing where we're starting off. So
yeah, and such an important part in the art of medicine is really like asking intelligent and informative questions, right? And that's where when I mentioned like women aren't given the opportunity to fully investigate what's going on, often they're just not being asked enough questions. And doctors, actually, we like see this in the literature as well, that doctors don't ask about sleep unless it's brought forward. And patients, especially if we look at women who are going through menopause, probably underreport sleep issues as well, because it's just something that we think we have to live with. So when we say 60% of women over the course of their lifetime will experience sleep disturbance, I actually think that's probably an underestimation because of those two reasons. Like if we don't ask about it and if we don't talk about it, then there's probably more happening than we know.
Yeah. And I think, you know, going back to previous generations, I don't think women have really, it's just been a given, you know, she's going, oh, it's a menopausal, you know, that's a moment for her. Whereas I do believe we're sort of the first generation to say, you know, we want a bit more information. I'm sure all generations wanted the info. We are lucky enough that we're in that time now where we can search out these questions and get the answers. So I think it's really cool that we can start changing that narrative, changing the don't know what to ask and downplaying and all of this stuff, and understanding that we're actually so important. We are worth finding all of this information about. We are worth having that delicious sleep in sometimes, you know? So I think it's a really good point there that you made. I think it's, in the past, women haven't known to ask, and maybe still they don't really think that they deserve to ask, but, you know, we're saying, ask away. And, you know,
absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many factors, right? Maybe these topics were taboo at a certain point. And then we have the Women's Health Initiative, which was that landmark study in the early 2000s that came out and said, like, stop the presses if you're on hormone replacement therapy, it causes breast cancer, da, 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 da. But we've actually reanalyzed that information to look at it, and the increase in breast cancer in one of the subgroups was actually not statistically significant. So it was just as likely due to chance. And the type of hormone therapy that you use and the route of administration, meaning if you take conjugated equine, like horse-based estrogen, which are synthetic estrogens, compared to transdermal, which is through the skin, estradiol, which is the same estrogen that we produce. And if you take and use progestins, which are synthetic versions of progesterone, not the same as progesterone at all, compared to oral or transdermal progesterone, they have very different effects and very different side effects, very different safety profiles, very different levels of efficacy. And so unless you're working with a doctor or practitioner who is taking it upon themselves to be well-versed in this information, it's very easy for us as consumers and us as practitioners to just see the headlines and go with it. Oh, that's right. The Women's Health Initiative said that HRT causes cancer. End of story.
Yeah. And that's what people remember.
Yeah. And women remember like their mom or their grandmas coming off the HRT, right? And so now that there's a fear narrative around that, and then if they go to their doctor, maybe their doctor doesn't actually know how to answer their questions or talk to them about their risk assessment or discuss the different routes and methods of administration and the options available to them so that they can actually make an informed choice.
That's right.
And so my message is always to like work with practitioners who are well-versed in this area, because not every general practitioner and medical doctor is going to be interested in hormone health, right? And not every naturopathic doctor is going to be interested in hormone health either.
That's right.
So find somebody who's done extra training, who's well-versed, and who's willing to have a conversation with you and answer your questions, and isn't pushing an agenda. So isn't saying like, you have to do HRT, or like, I don't believe in HRT.
Okay. Good point.
Right. Because
good point.
Like, even if it's like, you have to do the ketogenic diet, or like, no, the ketogenic diet is bad. Like have a conversation about the intervention, what it is, how it impacts you, what are the risks, what are the benefits, how do you feel about it? And then you make a choice with the information versus fear or uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right.
That is excellent advice. That really is. And it's funny because one of my questions for you was, what questions should someone ask a caregiver, or who should they reach out to? I think, I'd love to think that a lot of people are seeing this today and think, oh, I want to speak to Leigha, because, knowing what sleep can do to people, it's, I can speak to sleep, which I do with clients, but you're on a whole, obviously different level, and you've got the, access to all the tests, which are so important for women to know about. So, tell us a bit about how you work with your clients. Do you do any remote for people that can't get to you? Do you have all people come to you? Where are you? That kind of thing.
Yeah. In this post-pandemic world, I'm currently operating a virtual practice. And so you can apply to work with me through my website, which hopefully we can link everybody up with, or if you just like Google my name, you should be easily able to find me.
I'll make sure it's put out there.
Yeah. And then typically what care looks like is an initial visit, which gives us the opportunity to do a deep dive on your current concerns and health history. And then we move through that 5-step framework. And maybe that takes us 5 visits. Maybe it takes us 10, right? Everybody's going to have a different speed at which they're able to take information and act on it. Right. Yes. And like I said, maybe it's simple because you have hot flashes and or hormonal symptoms you don't even know. You're like, am I in perimenopause? I have no idea like what's happening. And you just want to have a conversation about what that is and what that looks like and what your treatment options are, right? So maybe there's a discovery phase in your care where we spend time on that and then you weigh your options. Right. And for some patients, we work consistently, we're meeting more regularly because their sleep is more of a challenge and they need more accountability, right? And maybe their health is more complex. So there's not a one size fits all, but typically we meet for that initial visit. I either look at recent blood work or we'll talk about what testing might be indicated. We run that, we come back and we move through that 5-step framework according to how long it takes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is going to, more than anything, I know this episode will give women such hope, because I know there's a lot of women out there who just think sleep is, whether they just think they'll never sleep again, or whether they're the group of, they just power through. They didn't even know it was an option to be able to sleep properly.
Yeah.
So, well, when we're finished this, we'll stick around after and I'll chat with you a bit, but I really, on behalf of everyone watching, want to thank you for your time today, because it's a huge topic. I know a lot of women stress with this one. So thank you so much for your time. And we'll make sure that all of Dr. Leigha's links are out there. And we'll put them on the website. We'll put them as well, which the link will be below, but we will also put them on our Modern Women's Menopause Facebook group page. But just reach out and I'll make sure that you get the information for her. So we're talking about having a live post-show discussion. So if people do want to check out Modern Women's Menopause on Facebook, you'll be able to find that if we end up doing that, which I think it'd be great to do. So
yeah, I'd love to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening. And everybody, I hope if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And ladies, especially, just understand that going through this whole journey, you are not alone, and there's so much support out there, and one example right here. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Carolyn.
Thank you.